The iron shackles had worn grooves into Mira's wrists by the time they dragged her onto the platform, but the physical pain meant nothing compared to the weight of 22 years spent believing she was born to be owned. The summer sun blazed mercilessly over the slave market, where alphas examined merchandise with the casual cruelty of commerce, and betas calculated investments in flesh and bone. Mira had learned long ago that eye contact meant interest, and interest meant pain that went far deeper than whips or brands. She was prime stock, they announced to the gathering crowd. Unbonded omega, fertile, trained in domestic service, and marked with the breeding farm seal burned into her shoulder blade like a signature of shame. The auctioneer's voice carried across the marketplace like a death sentence disguised as opportunity, each bid reducing her worth to numbers that echoed in the hollow spaces where hope used to live. But when a voice from the shadows raised the final offer, doubling the previous amount without showing his face, every wolf in the market fell into the kind of silence that precedes storms. The scent that reached her then should have been impossible to detect through the suppression drugs pumped into slaves daily, designed to dull their senses and keep their wolves buried so deep they forgot they'd ever been wild. Pine forest and mountain stone, power barely contained, ancient as the laws that govern their kind. The Alpha King had come to buy a slave. But as their eyes met across the crowd of jeering faces and calculating stares, Mira realized with crystal clarity that she wasn't just merchandise anymore. She was prey, and he was the predator who'd been hunting her across time and fate and circumstances that should have made their meeting impossible. Chapter 1. Raventhorn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, had not intended to attend a slave auction. Political necessity had brought him to this border town where the stench of desperation clung to weathered buildings like morning fog that refused to lift. Treaties needed negotiating, territorial disputes required resolution, and his advisors had been pressuring him for months to make an appearance in the outer provinces where loyalty sometimes wavered like candle flames in winter wind. The detour to the marketplace had been tactical, nothing more. His spies reported illegal omega trafficking through these very stores, operations that violated every treaty his territories had signed and every principle his rule represented. Intelligence gathering, they called it. Know your enemy's methods before you strike. He had not expected to send his mate among the condemned. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over behind the merchant stall where he'd positioned himself to observe without being seen. Pine and winterstone, his own scent, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the delicate fragrance that called to something primal in his chest. Wild flowers after rain, honey warmed by summer sun, and underneath it all, the unmistakable sweetness that marked an omega's soul, despite whatever chemical suppressants they'd forced into her system. She stood on that platform like dignity given human form, even with shackles binding her wrists and auction numbers chalked across her collarbone. 22, maybe 23 years old, with chestnut hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes the color of amber that had been buried in mountain caves for centuries. The breeding farm's brand scarred her shoulder blade, but she held herself with quiet strength that no amount of systematic breaking had managed to destroy. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to shift, to tear through the crowd with claws and fangs, to reclaim what the universe had marked as if before another bidder could steal her away. But 20 years of ruling had taught him that power meant choosing the most effective path, not always the most satisfying one. The transaction completed with brutal efficiency that made his wolf howl silently in his chest. Papers signed with ink that might as well have been blood. Ownership transferred through legal channels that transformed living souls into property with nothing more than signatures and silver coins. He paid triple the highest bid without negotiation, let them assume he was simply another wealthy alpha with expensive tastes and money to burn on pretty slaves. No questions asked about why royalty would purchase damaged goods from a market that operated in legal grey areas. No one cared about his motivations as long as his gold was real and his credentials checked out through the proper channels. Mira followed 3 steps behind, as protocol demanded. Her bare feet silent on cobblestones, still warm from the day's heat. She had learned to survive by becoming invisible, anticipating needs before they were spoken, existing in the spaces between heartbeats, where masters forgot to notice their property. 6 years of captivity had taught her that slaves who drew attention rarely lived long enough to regret the mistake. But the Alpha King's silence unnerved her more than shouting would have. No commands about posture or pace. No explanations about expectations or punishments for failure to meet them. Just the overwhelming presence of power that made her wolf whimper in the deepest recesses of her mind, where consciousness couldn't quite reach, but instinct still recognized what it meant to be near an apex predator who could end her existence with casual ease. The suppression drugs ensured she couldn't shift, couldn't access the strength that might have saved her family all those years ago when raiders came in the night with fire and chains. Couldn't even properly scent the man who now owned her, though something about his presence made her skin prickle with awareness that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. When they reached his private carriage, dark wood polished to mirror brightness and wheels that spoke of wealth beyond anything she'd encountered in her brief life of freedom, Raven turned to study her with silver eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone. To the woman she'd been before, chains and brands and systematic breaking had tried to erase her completely. The question, when it came, struck her like lightning, illuminating a landscape she'd forgotten existed. "What is your name?" Names were privileges. Slaves weren't permitted. She had been 17 for so long that her birth name felt like clothing that no longer fit, syllables that belonged to a girl who died the night her parents bled out on their kitchen floor while she hid in the root cellar like a coward. But something in his voice, patient rather than commanding, curious rather than calculating, made her remember that girl who'd once believed she mattered enough to have a name that meant something. "Mira," she whispered, the word emerging like a prayer spoken in a language she'd almost forgotten. The way he repeated it, tasting each syllable as if it were something sacred he'd been searching for his entire life, made her chest tight with an emotion she'd forbidden herself to feel. Hope was a luxury slaves couldn't afford, but standing in the shadow of this powerful stranger who'd paid a fortune for her freedom, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who might see her as more than property to be used and discarded. "Mira," Raven said again, and something in the way her name sounded in his voice made her think that perhaps her story wasn't ending after all, but finally beginning. The Northern Territory's royal stronghold carved itself from living rock, a fortress that had withstood centuries of siege and storm, while snow-capped peaks stood sentinel against horizons that stretched beyond the edge of imagination. Mira had expected dungeons when the carriage finally stopped after 3 days of travel through wilderness that grew more beautiful and more intimidating with each passing mile. She had prepared herself for breeding chambers, for the clinical efficiency of royal consumption that would make her previous captivity seem gentle by comparison. Instead, she found herself standing in servants' quarters larger than any space she'd been permitted to occupy since childhood. A real bed with blankets that smelled of lavender instead of fear, a window overlooking pine forests that stretched to horizons she'd forgotten existed, and most shocking of all, a door that locked from the inside rather than the outside. Helena, the stronghold's head housekeeper, appeared within the hour with clothing that covered rather than displayed, food that nourished rather than merely sustained, and explanations that made no sense according to everything Mira had learned about how the world worked for people like her. "His Majesty has unusual ideas about household management," Helena explained with a kind of carefully neutral tone that suggested years of practice in diplomatic understatement. Her greying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes held warmth that Mira had learned not to trust, but found herself desperately wanting to believe. "You'll find service here different from what you may have experienced elsewhere." Different proved to be an understatement that bordered on criminal inadequacy. No other slaves moved through the stronghold's corridors with their eyes downcast and their voices carefully modulated to avoid giving offense. The staff consisted entirely of paid employees who met her gaze directly, spoke to her as if she possessed thoughts worth hearing, and treated her with a casual respect that made her skin crawl with its unfamiliarity. Most disturbing of all, she encountered no breeding schedule pinned to her door each morning, no mandatory presentations to visiting dignitaries who might wish to sample the royal collection, no alpha visitors prowling the servant quarters with the predatory confidence of men who knew they could take whatever caught their interest without consequence or complaint. For 3 days, Mira waited for the other shoe to drop with a kind of paranoid vigilance that had kept her alive through 6 years of systematic horror. Alpha Kings didn't purchase Omega slaves for charity, no matter how unusual their household management might be. The mate bond suppressants still flowing through her bloodstream prevented her from detecting his true intentions, but instinct honed by years of survival screamed warnings she couldn't interpret through the chemical fog that clouded her senses. On the 4th night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that seemed to reach her very bones, she discovered him in his private study. Floor-to-ceiling windows reveal the forest under moonlight ancient pines swaying in wind that carried scents of snow and wildness and freedom she'd forgotten how to imagine. Raven stood silhouetted against silver illumination, like a figure from the old stories. Her grandmother had whispered before the raiders came with fire and chains and the systematic destruction of everything that had made her world safe. He'd removed his formal court attire for simple dark clothes that somehow made him appear more dangerous rather than less. Without the royal regalia and ceremonial armor that proclaimed his status to anyone with eyes to see, he looked like what he truly was beneath the crown and the political necessities, an apex predator who'd earned his position through strength rather than inheritance, intelligence rather than birthright. "You're afraid," he observed, without turning around, his voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that suggested he'd been aware of her presence from the moment she'd entered his private space. "I'm a slave," Mira replied, the response as automatic as breathing and twice as necessary for survival. Fear was the currency that kept property alive, the tribute that masters expected and servants learned to provide without conscious thought. Fear keeps us alive. And what if I told you that slavery had been abolished in the Northern Territories 5 years ago? The words struck her like physical blows, each syllable hitting with enough force to make her take an involuntary step backward. Impossible. Her logical mind insisted with a kind of desperate certainty that came from years of conditioning designed to break hope before it could take root. Masters lied as easily as breathing, told slaves whatever stories would make them more compliant, more grateful, more willing to accept whatever scraps of mercy fell from tables where real people made decisions about property that walked and talked and bled, but didn't matter in any way that counted. But her wolf stirred for the first time in years, pressing against the chemical barriers that held it captive with something that felt dangerously like desperate hope. The suppressants couldn't completely silence instincts that reached back to the beginning of time, and those ancient instincts whispered that this man might be telling her something closer to truth than any words she'd heard since the night her family died. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why purchase me if slavery is illegal? Why bring me here if you don't intend to use me the way masters use slaves?" Raven turned then, and the expression on his face made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. Not the calculated assessment she expected from someone evaluating property, not the casual indifference of an owner who knew he could discard what he'd bought without consequence. Something softer, more complicated, infinitely more terrifying because it suggested she might matter in ways that had nothing to do with her value as merchandise. "Because," he said quietly, silver eyes holding hers with intensity that made her feel exposed and sheltered simultaneously, "someone had to buy your freedom before you could choose what to do with it." Sleep became Mira's enemy and salvation in the weeks that followed her arrival at the stronghold. Freed from the suppression drugs that had dulled her senses for 6 years, her body began the slow, agonizing process of remembering what it meant to be a wolf. The withdrawal symptoms came in waves that left her shaking and nauseous, but beneath the physical discomfort, something far more profound was awakening. Her dreams exploded with sensory overload that made waking life seem pale and muted by comparison. Colors existed that had no names in human language, scents that told stories spanning generations, sounds that carried meaning beyond words. In these dreams, she wasn't the broken slave who flinched at sudden movements and spoke only when spoken to. She was wild, powerful, free in ways that made her chest ache with longing when consciousness dragged her back to reality. But the most vivid dreams, the ones that left her gasping and disoriented when she woke, featured a massive silver wolf with eyes the color of storm clouds. They ran together through moonlit forests as if choreographed by forces older than civilization, two parts of a whole that had been separated by cruel circumstance rather than natural law. When the dream wolf nuzzled her throat with reverent gentleness, she felt completion so profound that waking became a form of torture. The wolf's presence in her dreams grew stronger each night, more real, more necessary. Sometimes they hunted together, moving through ancient pines with predatory grace that felt like coming home to a truth she'd always known but never been permitted to acknowledge. Other times, they simply ran for the joy of movement, for the intoxicating freedom of muscles working in perfect harmony, for the wild pleasure of existing without fear or restraint, or the constant vigilance that had defined her waking hours for so long. Most disturbing of all were the dreams where they shifted back to human form, standing naked under starlight in clearings that sparkled with moonstone dust. The dream man had Raven's face, his silver eyes, his powerful frame, but in these visions he touched her with a tenderness that made her so weak. His hands traced her scars not with pity, but with reverence, as if each mark told a story of survival that deserved honor rather than shame. Waking brought its own revelations that proved the dreams weren't mere fantasy born of loneliness and suppressed instincts. Her reflection showed changes the suppressants had hidden for years, transformations that should have been impossible but felt absolutely right. Her eyes shifted from brown to amber in unguarded moments, catching light in ways that made Helena do double takes. Her hearing had sharpened until she could distinguish individual heartbeats through stone walls, could catch conversations from rooms away, could detect emotional changes in people's scents that revealed their true feelings regardless of the words they spoke. Most dramatically, strength was returning to muscles that had been artificially weakened for so long she'd forgotten what her body was capable of when fully awakened. Everyday objects felt fragile as spun glass. Doors that had once required effort now opened with barely a touch. And more than once she'd accidentally crushed eating utensils between fingers that remembered what it meant to possess supernatural power. Raven appeared in doorways at precisely the moments her control wavered, as if some internal radar guided him to her distress with uncanny accuracy. He never touched without permission, never commanded what he could request, never treated her as property, despite legal documents that said otherwise. The kindness was almost worse than cruelty had been, because it made her hope, and hope hurt worse than any physical wound she'd ever endured. During the long hours while he conducted royal business with advisors and diplomats and the endless parade of people who required his attention, Mira explored the stronghold with Helena's blessing and encouragement. The library contained thousands of texts about mate bonds, pack law, the ancient rites that supposedly protected omegas from exploitation. Reading them felt like discovering a language she'd been born speaking, but forced to forget through years of systematic conditioning designed to make her believe she was less than human. One passage haunted her above all others, copied from a text so old the ink had faded to barely legible brown script. The mate bond cannot be forged through proximity or wishful thinking. It exists or it doesn't. Recognized by the moon goddess herself, and stronger than any mortal law or circumstance, when true mates find each other, the connection transcends physical reality, manifesting in shared dreams, heightened abilities, and an awareness of each other's emotional state that no distance can diminish. The description matched her experiences with terrifying accuracy. The dreams of running with a silver wolf, the way Raven always appeared when she needed him most, the strange sense that part of her consciousness was always aware of his presence even when they were separated by stone walls and the complex protocols of royal life. If the mate bond couldn't be manufactured or imagined into existence, if it truly was a gift from the moon goddess that connected souls across time and circumstance, then what did that mean for a broken slave and an alpha king whose worlds should never have intersected? What did it mean that the universe had apparently decided they belonged to each other despite every logical reason why such a connection was impossible? And most frightening of all, if the bond was real and undeniable, what would Raven do when he finally acknowledged its existence? Would he see it as a blessing or as a cosmic joke that had saddled him with a mate whose past made her unsuitable for any future that involved standing beside a king? The summons arrived on official royal stationery, the Northern Territory's seal pressed into midnight blue wax that still carried the faint scent of pine and authority. Mira's presence was required at the monthly Pack Council meeting, Helena explained with uncharacteristic nervousness as she delivered the formal invitation. Not as a servant carrying refreshments or standing silently in corners where important people could ignore her existence, but as a matter under discussion. The very idea made Mira's hands shake as she read the formal language that transformed her from invisible property into a subject worthy of political attention. She had spent 6 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, becoming so forgettable that masters sometimes forgot they owned her for days at a time. Now, the most powerful wolves in the Northern Territories wanted to examine her under the harsh light of official scrutiny. The council chamber, intimidated by design, its vaulted ceilings carved with the Northern Territory's history in intricate detail that spoke of battles won and enemies conquered through superior strength and strategic brilliance. The circular table seated the realm's most powerful alphas, betas, and selected omegas in perfect equality, or so the theory proclaimed. In practice, Mira felt every gaze like a physical weight, every whispered conversation like judgment being passed on, her worthiness to exist in the same space as people who shaped the fate of nations. Ancient tapestries depicted legendary wolves whose exploits had become the foundation of pack law, while massive windows offered views of the mountain peaks that served as natural fortifications against enemies who might challenge the Alpha King's authority. Everything about the chamber proclaimed power, permanence, the kind of unshakable strength that had endured for centuries and would continue long after current occupants had returned to dust. Raven commanded attention effortlessly from his position at the table's head, dressed in full royal regalia that transformed him from the quietly approachable man she'd begun to know into the apex predator who ruled through strength and intelligence rather than inherited privilege. The crown caught light from crystal chandeliers. Ceremonial armor gleamed with polish that spoke of military precision, and his formal bearing reminded everyone present of exactly who held ultimate authority over their territories and their lives. But when his silver eyes found hers across the chamber filled with political tension and barely contained curiosity, something private and warm flickered beneath the public mask. The mate bond, growing stronger each day despite her attempts to ignore its implications, transmitted reassurance that settled her racing heartbeat and reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone in this room full of strangers who would decide her fate. "We gather to address an unusual situation," announced Marcus Reed, the pack's senior beta and Raven's closest advisor since childhood. His weathered face carried scars from battles fought before Mira was born, and his voice held the kind of authority that came from years of standing beside kings during their darkest hours. "His Majesty has brought an omega of uncertain provenance into the royal household. Given recent territorial tensions and ongoing security concerns, the Council requires clarification of her status and intentions." The euphemisms barely concealed the underlying accusations that hung in the air like smoke from poorly tended fires: spy, infiltrator, security risk, political liability. Mira had expected such suspicions, but hearing them voiced aloud in formal language that reduced her existence to a problem requiring solution still stung with the sharp edge of old wounds that had never properly healed. "The omega in question," Raven replied, with a kind of dangerous quiet that made even the most powerful alphas shift uncomfortably in their ornate chairs, "was purchased legally from a licensed dealer and freed immediately upon entering Northern Territory lands. Her presence here falls under the Crown's established policy regarding refugee assistance and reintegration." The careful phrasing acknowledged the political realities, while revealing nothing that could be used against either of them. But Mira could feel the undercurrents of tension that rippled through the assembled wolves, could scent the mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and barely concealed hostility that her presence had triggered among people who viewed any change to established order as potential threat. Council member Lady Sarah Blackwood, an omega who had clawed her way to political power through brilliance and ruthless calculation that put most alphas to shame, leaned forward with predatory interest that made Mira's skin crawl with unwelcome recognition. She had survived the same systematic oppression that had nearly destroyed Mira, but instead of developing empathy, Lady Blackwood seemed to view other omegas as competition for scarce resources and political attention. "Forgive the indelicacy, Your Majesty," Lady Blackwood said with acid sweetness that carried undertones of steel. But rumors suggest your interest in this particular refugee extends beyond charitable impulse or standard refugee protocols. The challenge hung in formal language that everyone present understood perfectly. The council suspected a maid bond, and if such suspicions proved correct, Mira's presence would trigger ancient laws about royal bloodlines, succession rights, and the complex political implications of an unbonded king claiming a former slave as potential queen. Political marriages among royalty were carefully negotiated affairs that took years to arrange, involving treaties, territorial agreements, bloodline considerations that stretch back generations. The idea that their alpha king might have found his mate through random chance at a slave market threatened to upset political calculations that had been decades in the making. Rumors, Raven said, with a kind of careful neutrality that revealed nothing while promising consequences for those who push too far, are dangerous foundations for policy decisions that affect the stability of our territories. Then perhaps Lady Blackwood continued with the relentless persistence of a predator who had scented weakness. The Omega could address our concerns directly. After all, she's perfectly capable of speaking for herself, assuming the stories about Northern Territory equality are more than pretty words designed to impress neighboring kingdoms. Every head in the chamber turned toward Mira with expectant attention that felt like being examined under harsh sunlight after years of living in shadows. 6 years of conditioning screamed at her to deflect, defer, disappear into the corners where property belonged until real people finished their important conversations. But as she met Raven's gaze across the chamber filled with political tension and ancient prejudices, she realized this moment would define not just her fate, but his. The Pack Council was testing their Alpha King's judgment through her, using her presence to probe for weaknesses that could be exploited by enemies who questioned his fitness to rule. Her response would either validate his decision to bring her here, or provide ammunition for those who sought to undermine his authority through personal attacks disguised as political necessity. Standing slowly, Mira felt her wolf surge forward with strength she had forgotten she possessed, and the power that had been suppressed but never truly broken by years of systematic degradation, designed to make her believe she was less than nothing. Before Mira could speak, the council chamber doors burst open with enough force to rattle ancient hinges that had withstood centuries of political storms and military sieges. The scent that preceded the intruder made every wolf in the room tense with instinctive wariness, their bodies responding to chemical signals that spoke of territorial challenge and barely contained aggression. Southern territories, old money, alpha dominance backed by political ambition, and the kind of entitlement that came from generations of unchallenged privilege. Lord Victor Ashford entered like a man accustomed to claiming whatever space he occupied through sheer force of personality and the wealth that opened doors throughout the supernatural world. Golden-haired and aristocratic, with the kind of classical features that graced ancient portraits and political propaganda, he commanded attention through presence rather than royal blood or inherited titles. Behind him came an entourage that included some of the Northern Territory's most influential nobles, their support clearly arranged in advance through careful negotiation and promises that would reshape territorial politics for generations to come. The political implications were immediately clear to everyone present. This wasn't a spontaneous visit or diplomatic courtesy call, but a carefully orchestrated challenge to Raven's authority disguised as concern for territorial law and order. Victor had allies within the Northern Territories, wolves who questioned their Alpha King's unconventional policies and longed for the traditional hierarchies that had defined pact law for centuries. "Forgive the interruption," Victor said with a smile that managed to be both charming and threatening. The kind of expression that promising politicians perfected through years of practice in rooms where words carried the weight of armies and treaties. "But I understand we're discussing the acquisition His Majesty made at the border markets." The word choice wasn't accidental. Acquisition reduced Mira from person to object, from refugee to merchandise, from someone worthy of protection to property that could be bought, sold, or reclaimed, according to whoever held legal documents and political leverage. Every wolf in the chamber understood the subtle insult embedded in Victor's phrasing, the calculated disrespect that tested boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability. Raven's stillness became predatory in response, the kind of absolute calm that preceded violence when apex predators decided diplomacy had reached its natural limits. His silver eyes never left Victor's face, but Mira could feel the mate bond humming with barely contained fury that promised consequences for anyone who threatened what belonged to him. "Lord Ashford," Raven said with deceptive mildness that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their ornate chairs. "Your business here was not announced through proper diplomatic channels. A matter of some delicacy that required immediate attention," Victor replied smoothly, his gaze sweeping the chamber before settling on Mira with uncomfortable intensity that made her skin crawl with recognition. She had seen that look before in the eyes of masters who viewed slaves as entertainment rather than labor. Alphas who enjoyed the psychological torture that came with absolute power over someone who couldn't fight back. "You see, the Omega in question was stolen from my family's estate 6 years ago during a particularly violent raid. I've come to reclaim what rightfully belongs to me." The lie was beautifully constructed, delivered with aristocratic confidence that made it almost believable to anyone who didn't know the truth about how slave markets really operated. Mira's hands clenched into fists as memories surfaced unbidden. Images she had spent years trying to suppress through sheer force of will and the survival instinct that demanded she focus on present threats rather than past trauma. She remembered the raiders who had burned her family's farm with methodical efficiency, the traders who had examined her like livestock before deciding she was young enough and pretty enough to fetch premium prices at the breeding facilities. She remembered the systematic erasure of her identity until she became just another numbered commodity in ledgers that reduced living souls to profit margins and investment opportunities. Interesting. Lady Blackwood observed with sharp interest that cut through the chamber's tense atmosphere like a blade designed for political surgery. "Do you have documentation supporting this rather serious claim?" Victor produced papers with theatrical flourish, that spoke of preparation and political calculation rather than spontaneous concern for missing property. The documents looked official, bore impressive seals, carried the kind of bureaucratic weight that transformed lies into legal truth through nothing more than proper presentation and institutional authority. Purchase records, breeding certificates, proof of ownership dating back 6 years, he announced to the assembled council with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. The girl was taken during the raid on my holdings, a traumatic experience that likely affected her memory of events. Slaves often develop selective amnesia about their origins when subjected to extreme stress or systematic conditioning designed to break their resistance. The fabrication was masterful in its plausibility, accounting for any protests Mira might make while establishing Victor as the reasonable party seeking to resolve an unfortunate misunderstanding through proper legal channels. Who would believe the word of a former slave against the Lord's sworn testimony, especially when that testimony came with documentation that appeared to meet every bureaucratic requirement? But as Victor spoke, weaving his careful web of half-truths and strategic omissions, Mira caught something else in his scent that the chemical suppressants had prevented her from detecting at first. Beneath the surface layers of expensive cologne and political confidence lay hunger, possessiveness, the kind of obsession that had nothing to do with property rights and everything to do with power over someone who couldn't escape or retaliate. Of course, Victor continued smoothly, his attention shifting to Raven with calculated respect that barely concealed underlying threat. I'm prepared to be reasonable about this unfortunate matter. His Majesty acted in good faith, purchasing what he believed to be legitimately available merchandise from dealers who may have misrepresented the Omega's true status. I propose a private arrangement to resolve this misunderstanding without involving territorial courts or diplomatic complications that could affect relationships between our regions. Raven's voice could have frozen summer when he responded, each word carrying the weight of royal authority and personal fury that had been carefully contained but never truly suppressed. What kind of arrangement? A trade? Naturally. I have something you want, you have something I want. Perhaps we can find mutual benefit in exchange rather than legal complications that would inevitably attract unwanted attention from neighboring territories. Victor's smile turned predatory, revealing the true nature that aristocratic manners had been designed to conceal. After all, Your Majesty, surely one Omega isn't worth risking diplomatic relations with the Southern Territories and their extensive network of political allies. The threat wasn't subtle or diplomatic, but a direct challenge to Raven's authority disguised as reasonable negotiation. Victor represented more than personal ambition or individual greed. He spoke for factions that questioned every progressive policy the Northern Territories had implemented. Nobles who resented changes to traditional power structures, alphas who preferred the old ways where Omega rights were suggestions rather than laws backed by royal authority. But as the political machinations swirled around her like smoke from fires that would consume everything she had begun to hope for, Mira felt something unprecedented rising within her chest. Not the helpless fury of the powerless, not the desperate rage of someone who had no choice but to accept whatever fate others decided for her. This was clean anger, righteous indignation, the fierce protective instinct of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. The council session ended without resolution. But the real danger began after formal proceedings concluded with diplomatic language that satisfied no one and resolved nothing. Mira found herself escorted not to her comfortable quarters in the servants' wing, but to a secure chamber deep within the stronghold's heart, surrounded by stone walls thick enough to muffle screams and iron doors that spoke of dungeons rather than guest accommodations. Protection, Helena assured her with worried eyes that contradicted her reassuring words, though the locked door and posted guards suggested imprisonment disguised as safety. Through narrow windows that had been designed more for defense than illumination, she watched Victor's entourage establish themselves in the stronghold's guest wing with the confident efficiency of an occupying army. Their presence infected the ancient fortress like a disease, servants whispering nervously as they went about their duties, guards taking extra shifts with hands resting on weapon hilts. An atmosphere of barely contained violence thickening with each passing hour as two incompatible forces occupied the same space. The political implications were staggering in their complexity. Victor hadn't come alone or unprepared, but with enough allies and documentation to force a crisis that could destabilize everything Raven had built during his years of progressive rule. The traditional factions who resented changes to pack law saw this as their opportunity to challenge an alpha king whose policies favored equality over hierarchy, whose innovations threatened power structures that had endured for centuries. Raven appeared at midnight, entering through a concealed passage she hadn't noticed during her earlier exploration of the chamber's limited space. Without his royal regalia, shadows clinging to his broad frame like living darkness, he looked more like the predator she'd first scented at the slave market than the diplomatically constrained king who'd faced the council with careful neutrality and political calculation. "His documents are forgeries," he said, without preamble, moving with a kind of controlled violence that made her wolf stir with recognition and longing. "Skillful ones that required significant resources and political connections, but forgeries nonetheless. My investigators found 3 different paper manufacturers, ink inconsistencies that span multiple time periods, seal impressions that don't match archived samples from the territories he claims to represent." Relief flooded through Mira so powerfully her knees nearly buckled beneath the weight of emotions she'd been holding in careful check since Victor's dramatic entrance. The fear that had been gnawing at her chest like acid, the terrible certainty that legal documents would triumph over truth, dissolved into something approaching hope for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "Then you can expose him," she said, voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter this moment of possibility. "Prove to the council that he's lying, that his claims have no basis in fact or law, not without proof that satisfies council members who want any excuse to challenge my authority." Raven replied grimly, his silver eyes reflecting moonlight that streamed through the chamber's defensive windows. "Victor has allies who've been waiting years for an opportunity like this." They'd claim I fabricated evidence to protect a personal interest, that royal authority was being used to cover up diplomatic embarrassment or worse. The brutal honesty of political reality settled over them like winter fog, cold and inescapable. Truth meant nothing without power to enforce it, and Victor had chosen his timing with strategic brilliance that accounted for every weakness in Raven's position as a progressive ruler in territories where many still longed for the old ways. "There's something else," Raven continued, moving closer until his scent enveloped her like armor against the fears that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. "My spies report movement along the southern border, armed groups, too organized to be simple raiders or territorial disputes, military formations that suggest preparation for something far larger than retrieving one escaped slave." The implication crystallized with terrifying clarity that made her stomach clench with dread. Victor hadn't come as an individual seeking to reclaim property, but as the advance scout for something approaching invasion. This wasn't about her specifically, but about using her as the excuse for actions that had been planned long before her existence became known to Southern Territory leadership. "He wants war," Mira whispered, understanding flooding through her with a kind of horrible certainty that came from finally seeing the pattern hidden within seemingly random events. "He wants leverage," Raven corrected, though his expression suggested the distinction might be meaningless in practical terms. "Political crisis that forces me to choose between personal desires and territorial security. You're the excuse, not the objective. But the end result could be the same if I miscalculate the response or underestimate how far his allies are willing to go to achieve their goals." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like lead, threatening to crush what remained of her newfound strength and confidence. Entire territories might bleed because an alpha king had chosen to free one slave, because the mate bond had connected two people whose worlds should never have intersected, because she had dared to hope that freedom might be possible for someone like her. "I won't trade you for peace," Raven said with fierce intensity that cut through her spiraling self-recrimination like a blade forged from starlight and determination. "Won't sacrifice you for political convenience or territorial stability. That's not who I am. And it's not who my territories will become under my rule, regardless of the pressure from traditional factions or external threats." The declaration should have comforted her, should have filled her with gratitude for protection she'd never expected to receive from anyone, especially not from royalty, whose primary concern should have been territorial welfare rather than individual rights. Instead, it terrified her with implications that extended far beyond personal safety into realms of political catastrophe that could reshape the supernatural world. "You'd risk everything for a slave you barely know?" she asked, the question emerging with desperation that revealed how little she still understood about her own worth or the forces that had brought them together against all logical probability. Something shifted in Raven's expression, vulnerability flickering beneath royal authority like candlelight glimpsed through storm-shattered windows. The careful control he maintained in public settings, the diplomatic restraint that had become second nature through years of political necessity, cracked just enough to reveal the man beneath the crown. "You're not a slave," he said quietly, his voice carrying conviction that brooked no argument or self-deprecation. "You've never been a slave, not in any way that matters to the universe or the moon goddess or the forces that govern what we truly are beneath political labels and legal documents. And I wouldn't risk everything for a stranger. But you're not a stranger. But?" The word escaped as barely more than breath, but he heard it with the supernatural senses that connected them through bonds deeper than conscious understanding. "You're my mate," Raven said simply, the words hanging between them like an incantation that rewrote reality through nothing more than acknowledged truth. The mate bond, suppressed but never broken, flared to life with sudden blazing intensity that made the chamber's ancient stones sing in harmony with frequencies that predated human civilization. This wasn't political convenience or romantic idealism, but recognition of connection that transcended mortal considerations and challenged every assumption about fate, choice, and the power of love to transform impossible circumstances into inevitable destiny. Before either could respond to the revelation that changed everything while changing nothing they hadn't already known in their hearts, alarms began echoing through the stronghold's corridors with urgent intensity that spoke of crisis rather than drill. Not the controlled signals of scheduled exercises, but the desperate clanging of actual emergency that sent ice through her veins and brought every protective instinct in Raven's powerful frame to immediate alertness. The attack came during the blood moon, when ancient magic ran strongest and pack bonds called to wolves with primal intensity that made resistance nearly impossible. Mira watched from her secured chamber as figures in dark clothing scaled the stronghold's supposedly unclimbable walls, moving with supernatural grace that spoke of vampire mercenaries or magically enhanced humans rather than simple raiders motivated by gold or territorial ambition. These weren't desperate bandits seeking easy targets, but professional killers whose movements carried the fluid precision of predators who had hunted supernatural prey across multiple continents. Their equipment gleamed with enchantments that would deflect most defensive spells. Their coordination spoke of military training that extended far beyond anything Victor could have arranged through normal diplomatic channels. The sounds of battle echoed through stone corridors with terrifying intensity that made her wolf pace frantically within the confines of her partially awakened consciousness. Steel ran against steel with the distinctive pitch that meant weapons forged specifically for supernatural combat. Inhuman growls reverberated through ancient walls as shifters abandoned human form for the deadly efficiency of their animal selves, and beneath it all came the distinctive crack of bones breaking under superhuman strength. Somewhere in that chaos, Raven fought for his crown, his people, his progressive vision of what the Northern Territories could become, and by extension, for her freedom and the future they might build together if they survived the next few hours. The mate bond transmitted echoes of his emotional state through their strengthening connection, flashes of tactical assessment mixed with protective fury that made her chest tight with longing and terror in equal measure. Unable to remain passive while others bled for her freedom, while the man she was beginning to love risked everything against enemies who would show no mercy to anyone associated with his regime. Mira explored the chamber with a desperate thoroughness that revealed details she'd missed during earlier, more casual examinations. Helena must have left supplies deliberately, hidden behind a loose stone that concealed emergency provisions, including a silver dagger with edges sharp enough to cut through supernatural hide, basic medical supplies that suggested preparation for the worst possible outcomes, and most importantly, a vial of emergency stimulant that would temporarily override any remaining suppression drugs in her system. The liquid glowed with faint phosphorescence that spoke of ingredients harvested during specific lunar phases, processed according to recipes that predated written history. One dose would fully awaken her wolf for the first time in 6 years, but the concentration required to counteract years of chemical suppression might also kill her if her system couldn't handle the shock of sudden, complete transformation. The decision should have required more consideration, should have involved weighing risks against benefits with the kind of careful calculation that had kept her alive through 6 years of systematic horror. Instead, Mira drank without hesitation, driven by instinct deeper than self-preservation and the bone-deep certainty that remaining helpless while others fought for her freedom was a form of cowardice she could no longer accept. The transformation was immediate and agonizing in ways that no amount of mental preparation could have anticipated. 6 years of chemical suppression shattered in moments as her wolf surged forward with desperate joy, flooding her nervous system with sensory input that had been denied for so long her brain struggled to process the overwhelming rush of awareness. Her senses exploded beyond anything she remembered from childhood, when her wolf had been young and untrained rather than systematically broken and rebuilt. Every scent told stories that stretched back hours. Every sound carried meaning that revealed the tactical situation with crystalline clarity, and beneath it all flowed the blood moon's power like liquid fire that made her skin tingle with supernatural energy. She could smell them now with accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. Victor and his men carried scents layered with deception, desperation, and something else that made her lip curl with instinctive revulsion. Fear. They hadn't expected the Alpha King's resistance to be so fierce, hadn't prepared for the loyalty his unconventional rule had earned from guards who served from choice rather than obligation or tradition. Following instincts awakened by moonlight and necessity, instincts that reached back to ancestors who had navigated hostile territory through wit and courage rather than political protection, Mira found passages through the stronghold that servants' knowledge revealed, but royal tours never included. The ancient fortress had been built by wolves for wolves with hidden roots that honored the pack's need for mobility and escape during siege conditions. She emerged in the great hall to find it transformed into a battlefield that would have horrified the diplomats who'd argued politics there just hours earlier. Raven fought at the center of swirling chaos, no longer the diplomatically restrained king who measured every word for political impact, but the apex predator who'd earned his crown through strength rather than inheritance or political maneuvering. His partial shift allowed claws capable of rending steel and enhanced speed that turned him into a blur of lethal grace while maintaining human intelligence for tactical assessment and strategic thinking. The combination was devastating, evidenced by the 3 attackers who lay unconscious or worse around his position, their expensive equipment, and supernatural enhancements, proving inadequate against raw skill honed through decades of combat experience. But Victor had brought more than hired muscle and enhanced mercenaries to this confrontation. Dark magic crackled around a robed figure who chanted in languages older than recorded history, weaving spells that turned the air thick as honey and made the stronghold's defensive walls flicker like dying candles in winter wind. The witch's magic reached for Raven like living shadow, tendrils of corrupted power that sought to bind his movements and cloud his tactical judgment at the precise moment when hesitation would prove fatal. Without conscious thought, driven by protective instincts that transcended rational consideration, Mira moved with her newly awakened supernatural speed. The silver dagger found its mark between the spellcaster's shoulder blades with accuracy that surprised her as much as anyone watching. But the real shock came from what happened next. As the witch's blood touched the stronghold's ancient floor, and something that had been sleeping for decades responded to her presence with explosive recognition. The fortress's embedded protections, dormant since the last Alpha Queen had died and taken her connection to the castle's founding magic with her, recognized a true mate's protective instincts and flared to blazing life with power that belonged to legends rather than modern warfare. Moonlight streaming through stained glass windows became weapon and shield simultaneously, driving back Victor's forces with brilliant silver radiance that seared enhanced vision and disrupted magical coordination. The stronghold itself had awakened to defend its new queen, and the ancient stones sang with harmonies that made every wolf present remember what it meant to belong to something larger than individual ambition. In the aftermath of battle, with Victor's surviving forces retreating into the night like shadows fleeing from dawn, and the stronghold's ancient protections blazing like a beacon visible for miles across the mountain peaks, Mira found herself alone with Raven in the great hall that had been transformed from diplomatic chamber to battlefield in the span of a single blood moon. Blood streaked his face and hands, dark stains that belonged to enemies rather than himself, and his silver eyes held the wild luminescence of a wolf still riding the edge of shift between human reason and animal instinct. The partial transformation that had made him so deadly in combat hadn't fully receded, leaving him caught between forms in a way that should have been uncomfortable, but instead radiated raw power that made her newly awakened wolf respond with desperate longing. "You saved us all," he said, voice rough with adrenaline and something deeper that made her chest tight with emotions she didn't have names for. The emergency stimulant still coursed through her system, making every sensation more vivid, every emotion more intense than anything she'd experienced since childhood. "The stronghold's defenses haven't responded to anyone since my grandmother died 30 years ago. They recognized you as queen before you even knew what you were becoming. Queen. The word should have overwhelmed her with its implications, should have sent her spiraling into panic about responsibilities she had no training to handle and expectations she could never hope to meet. But with her wolf finally free and moonlight singing in her veins like wine made from starlight, it felt like coming home to a truth she'd always known but never been permitted to acknowledge. "The mate bond," she said quietly, understanding, crystallizing with the kind of clarity that came from supernatural senses finally awakened to their full potential. "It's real, isn't it? Not wishful thinking or political convenience or some kind of magical manipulation designed to serve Victor's agenda. Yes. No hedging, no diplomatic careful phrasing designed to avoid commitment or leave room for political maneuvering. Just truth as stark and undeniable as the silver light that connected them across the blood-stained marble floor, visible now to her enhanced vision as threads of power that pulsed in rhythm with their synchronized heartbeats. But truth came with terrible choices that extended far beyond personal happiness into realms of political catastrophe that could reshape the supernatural world. "Victor will return," Mira said, forcing herself to think like the queen she was apparently becoming rather than the slave she'd been for so long. "If not him personally, then others like him with better planning and more resources. They'll use our bond to destabilize your rule, claim you're unfit to lead because you chose a former slave over political advantage and territorial security." The brutal honesty of their situation settled between them like winter fog, cold and inescapable. The mate bond made them stronger individually, but it also made them vulnerable to enemies who would exploit their connection for strategic advantage, who would use their love as a weapon against everything Raven had built during his years of progressive leadership. Raven closed the distance between them with predatory grace that made her breath catch in her throat, but his touch when he cupped her face was infinitely gentle, despite the claws that hadn't fully retracted and the supernatural strength that could have crushed her bones without effort. "Let them come," he said with conviction that burned like forge fire in his silver eyes. "Let them all come with their political calculations and their traditional prejudices, and their desperate need to maintain power structures that benefit no one except those who profit from others' suffering. They'll learn that the Northern Territories don't negotiate with terrorists, don't sacrifice innocence for political convenience, and don't trade away their queen for anyone's approval or threat of military action." The intensity of his conviction took her breath away, stealing oxygen from lungs that had forgotten how to function properly in the presence of someone who saw her as worthy of such fierce protection. This wasn't romantic idealism or political posturing, but granite determination of an alpha who'd found his mate and would burn the world before letting anyone take her away from him. "The claiming bite," Mira whispered, understanding flooding through her, with crystalline clarity that made everything else seem suddenly simple despite the political complexities that surrounded them. "You haven't given it to me yet." Claiming bites were permanent, irreversible, sacred bonds that linked Maze for life in ways that transcended political considerations and legal documents. Without one, their connection remained incomplete. powerful but vulnerable to magical interference, political manipulation, or the simple erosion of time and distance that could weaken even the strongest supernatural bonds. "Because it has to be your choice," Raven replied, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with reverent care that spoke of worship rather than possession. Not desperation born from crisis, not gratitude for rescue, not even the make bond itself compelling you toward decisions you might regret when the emergency passes and rational thought returns. It has to be what you want, freely given, without coercion or circumstance, forcing your hand toward choices you're not ready to make. The careful consideration he showed even now, even after she'd fought beside him and the stronghold itself had claimed her as rightful queen, made her chest tight with emotion that transcended simple affection or sexual attraction. This was recognition of her personhood, acknowledgement of her right to choose her own destiny, even when that choice might cost him everything he'd worked to build. Around them, moonlight continued to pulse through ancient windows, the stronghold's awakened magic, responding to their proximity with visible joy that made the very stones sing in harmonies that predated human civilization. This fortress had been built for mates, designed by wolves who understood that true power came not from dominance but from partnership between equals, who chose each other despite all logical reasons why such choices should be impossible. "I choose you," Mira said, the words emerging with ceremony she hadn't planned, but felt absolutely right as they left her lips. Not because fate demands it through bonds, I don't understand. Not because circumstances force it through crisis and political necessity, but because you gave me back my name, my wolf, my right to choose my own path through this world. I choose you, Raventhorn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, my mate. His control, maintained through years of diplomacy and crisis management and the careful restraint required of someone whose emotions could trigger international incidents, finally shattered like ice in spring sunshine. The kiss that preceded the claiming bite was hungry and desperate and perfect, tasting of moonlight and promises and futures that had seemed impossible just hours before. When his fangs pierced the joining point between her neck and shoulder, pleasure exploded through her system with such intensity that her vision went white and every nerve ending sang with supernatural ecstasy that redefined her understanding of what physical sensation could encompass. The mate bond, incomplete for so long, snapped into place with audible force that made the stronghold's ancient stones resonate in harmony with frequencies that reached back to the beginning of wolf history. She was queen, truly and completely marked and claimed and home in ways that transcended political titles or legal documentation. The bond between them blazed with silver fire that would burn for eternity, connecting them across any distance, through any crisis, beyond even death itself, into whatever realms awaited wolves who had found their other half in a world that tried to keep them apart. The claiming bite brought unexpected consequences, along with transcendent joy that had redefined every assumption Mira held about what her body was capable of experiencing. As dawn broke over the stronghold with golden light that seemed subdued compared to the supernatural radiance still pulsing between her and Raven, she found herself burning with fever that had nothing to do with her wounds from the night's battle or the residual adrenaline that continued coursing through her awakened system. Her body, finally free from years of suppression drugs, and now bonded to an alpha king whose bloodline traced back to the original wolf clans that had shaped supernatural law itself, was attempting a transformation she'd been denied for far too long. The claiming bite had triggered something ancient and powerful, a process that went beyond simple mate recognition into realms of magical integration that few wolves ever experienced. Raven never left her side as healers worked with desperate efficiency, their faces grave with concern that spoke of complications they'd read about in ancient texts, but never witnessed firsthand. The royal chambers had been transformed into a medical facility, with monitoring equipment that hummed softly alongside traditional healing crystals that pulsed with sympathetic energy, responding to the supernatural forces, reshaping her very essence. Her wolf is awakening completely, the head healer explained with barely concealed worry, her weathered hands moving over Mira's fevered skin with practiced efficiency that couldn't hide her underlying anxiety. Not just the surface consciousness that allows shifting between human and animal forms, but the deeper integration that creates the royal bond connecting her to the territory's foundational magic. It's unprecedented in someone who's been suppressed for so long. The careful diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the reality that everyone in the room understood, but no one wanted to speak aloud. Dangerous? Raven finished grimly, his silver eyes never leaving Mira's face as she drifted between consciousness and fevered delirium. Say it plainly. No political euphemisms or medical jargon designed to soften harsh realities. Her system has been chemically suppressed for 6 years, the healer replied with reluctant honesty. The level of magical integration attempting to occur through the royal claiming could kill her, or worse, leave her trapped between human and wolf consciousness, unable to complete either form or access the benefits of supernatural abilities while suffering the drawbacks of both states. Through waves of fever that made her feel like she was burning from the inside out, Mira heard their conversation as if from a great distance, her awareness drifting between states that defied logical categorization. Sometimes she experienced human consciousness, locked in flesh that felt foreign and restrictive, bones that seemed too small to contain the power, trying to express itself through her transformed nervous system. Other times, she found herself operating from wolf instincts that didn't understand walls or clothing or the complex emotional nuances that came with bipedal existence and political responsibility. In those moments, she wanted nothing more than to run through moonlit forests, to hunt with pack members who understood her without words, to exist in the simple clarity of predator and prey relationships that didn't require diplomatic consideration. But in the deepest moments of crisis, when her heart stuttered with rhythms that made monitoring equipment shriek with alarm and healers exchange looks that spoke of preparation for loss, she felt Raven's presence like an anchor that prevented her consciousness from drifting completely away from her physical form. Not just his proximity in the room, but the mate bond itself feeding her strength she didn't possess alone. The connection between them had become a lifeline that pulled her back from the edge of dissolution each time the transformation threatened to tear her apart at the cellular level. His emotional stability provided a foundation that her chaotic system could use to maintain some semblance of coherent identity, while supernatural forces rewrote the basic programming of her existence. "Stay with me," he whispered against her hair during the worst of it. When her temperature spiked so high that steam rose from her skin and the healers prepared ice baths that might preserve her brain function even if they couldn't stop the magical process, reshaping her from the inside out. "Fight your way back to me, Mira. Don't let the transformation take you where I can't follow." The mate bond carried more than emotional support during those critical hours. She could feel his strength flowing into her through their connection, his supernatural vitality supplementing her own when her body reached the limits of what it could endure alone. The royal bloodline that had seemed like burden and complication was proving to be salvation, providing exactly the power she needed to survive a process that would have killed any ordinary wolf. The transformation took 3 days and 2 nights of fevered delirium that blurred the boundaries between reality and hallucination, until she could no longer distinguish between memories of her human childhood and visions of running through territories that existed only in genetic memory, passed down through countless generations of wolves who had lived free. When she finally opened eyes that shifted seamlessly from brown to amber to silver and back again, responding to emotional states and supernatural influences with fluid grace that spoke of complete integration rather than awkward transition, the world looked entirely different than anything she remembered from her previous existence. Colors had new depth that revealed emotional resonances invisible to purely human vision. Scents told stories that stretched back hours and revealed the true feelings of everyone who'd passed through the room. And beneath it all thrummed the constant awareness of her mate's presence like a second heartbeat that would never fade or fail. "How do you feel?" Raven asked. Exhaustion evident in every line of his face after 3 days of maintaining vigil beside her bed, feeding her strength through their bond while managing the political crisis that Victor's attack had triggered throughout the northern territories. Mira took careful inventory of her transformed state, testing responses that should have felt foreign, but instead seemed like coming home to abilities she'd always possessed, but never been permitted to access. The fever had broken completely, leaving her body feeling simultaneously foreign and perfectly right, as if she'd been wearing clothing that was the wrong size for her entire life and had finally found garments tailored to her true proportions. "Powerful," she said finally, the word carrying weight that encompassed physical strength, magical ability, political authority, and something deeper that transcended simple categories. Complete in ways I never imagined were possible. The mate bond hummed between them with perfect harmony now, no longer the tentative connection of two souls finding each other across impossible circumstances, but the deep integration of partners who had become something greater together than either could achieve alone. She was queen not just in title but in truth, connected to the territory's foundational magic in ways that would let her protect and nurture the lands and people that had become her responsibility. Victor's return came exactly 1 week after the claim, but this time he brought not mercenaries or hired killers, but an army that stretched across the valley floor like a dark stain against the mountain landscape. The Southern Territories had officially declared the Northern Territories' refusal to surrender the stolen Omega, an act of aggression requiring military response, transforming what had begun as personal vendetta into international crisis that threatened to reshape the supernatural world. What they hadn't expected was the transformation that had occurred during their absence, the fundamental changes that had turned a progressive but politically vulnerable Alpha King and his newly claimed mate into something unprecedented in recorded history. Mira no longer hid in secured chambers or required protection beyond what any sovereign merited, and her connection to the territory's foundational magic had awakened abilities that their enemies couldn't have anticipated through even the most sophisticated intelligence gathering. The Alpha King's power, impressive before the claiming, had doubled through connection to his true mate, while their bond had stabilized into the kind of supernatural partnership that existed in legends rather than political reality. And Mira herself had become something that challenged every assumption about Omega capabilities. Not just queen by marriage, but a royal wolf whose bloodline reached back to the original magic that had shaped pack law when the world was young. Standing on the stronghold's highest tower as enemy forces arranged themselves in battle formations that spoke of professional military planning rather than territorial raids, Mira felt ancient knowledge stirring in her mind like sediment disturbed by deep currents. The suppression drugs hadn't just blocked her wolf or dampened her supernatural abilities. They'd severed her connection to genetic memories that carried the wisdom of ancestors whose names had been lost to time, but whose experiences lived on in bloodlines that remembered truth. "There's something they don't know," she told Raven, as they watched Victor's banners unfold in the morning sun, their colors bright against the mountain landscape that had become her home in ways that transcended simple geography. "Something the traders who sold me, the masters who branded me, even Victor himself doesn't understand about what I really am, or the forces he's trying to manipulate through political pressure and military intimidation." Raven's silver eyes sharpened with interest rather than concern, the mate bond carrying her confidence and certainty through their connection in ways that made verbal explanation almost unnecessary. He trusted her instincts completely now, had learned to recognize the difference between hope, born of desperation, and knowledge that emerged from sources deeper than conscious thought. The original curse, Mira continued, pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across centuries, finally falling into place, with stunning clarity that made her wonder how previous generations had failed to see the pattern. The one that created the breeding farms, the Omega slave trade, the systematic oppression that's poisoned pack law for generations. It wasn't natural evolution or political convenience or the inevitable result of alpha dominance. What was it? Raven asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand the implications of what she was discovering through genetic memory and supernatural intuition awakened by their royal bond. Dark magic cast centuries ago to break the original balance between alphas and omegas, to ensure alphas would always dominate rather than partner with their mates in the way the moon goddess intended when she created our species. Her voice carried growing power that made the air itself shimmer with supernatural energy. Responding to truths that had been hidden for so long, their revelation felt like earthquake tremors reshaping reality. But claiming bites between true mates, especially royal bloodlines, can break curses that affect entire populations if the connection is strong enough and the intention pure enough. The knowledge came from blood memory, from genetic heritage that connected her to every omega who'd suffered under the corruption of natural law, every wolf who'd been reduced to property instead of honored as partner. But knowledge alone wasn't enough to break a curse that had lasted centuries and affected millions of lives. Breaking a spell that had reshaped the fundamental nature of their species required power that neither she nor Raven possessed individually. Together, Raven asked, understanding flowing through their bond without need for detailed explanation or tactical planning. They had become something greater than the sum of their individual capabilities, their partnership transcending personal connection to become a force that could challenge magical corruption that had persisted for generations. Together, Mira confirmed, certainty settling into her bones like inheritance, finally claimed after years of exile and denial. What followed transcended traditional magic or political maneuvering, reaching into realms of power that predated recorded history and touched forces that had shaped the world when wolves first learned to shift between human and animal form. As Victor's forces began their advance up the stronghold slopes with military precision that spoke of months of planning and preparation, Mira and Raven stood together on the tower's highest point and called upon powers that connected them to the moon goddess herself. The mate bond between them became conduit for magic that swept outward like wildfire, invisible to normal vision, but devastating in its impact on supernatural consciousness throughout the region. Not harmful force designed to destroy or punish, but transformative energy that broke mental chains and restored natural balance that had been corrupted for so long most wolves had forgotten what freedom truly meant. The curses breaking sent shock waves through every wolf within 100-mile radius, touching minds that had been conditioned to accept artificial hierarchy and awakening them to the realization that Omega enslavement was perversion of natural law rather than divine mandate. Below in the valley, Victor's army simply stopped their advance. Not frozen by magical compulsion, but awakened to the understanding that they were fighting to preserve a system that had never been meant to exist. 10 years after the curse broke, Mira stood in the gardens where Victor's army had once gathered for battle, watching children play without regard for designation or hierarchy, while their laughter echoed off stones that remembered darker times. The monument erected in the valley's heart bore a simple inscription in silver letters that caught moonlight with supernatural brilliance. Love made visible what was always free. The transformation had rippled outward like wildfire, touching every territory where wolves had lived under artificial oppression designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Omega slaves across the continent found themselves suddenly, inexplicably free, not just legally but mentally liberated from conditioned acceptance that had made their suffering possible for generations. What had begun as one woman's escape from bondage had evolved into a supernatural civil rights revolution that rewrote the fundamental laws governing their species. The mate bond between Mira and Raven had proven more powerful than political resistance, more enduring than military force, more transformative than any treaty or diplomatic agreement ever negotiated in council chambers where equality was discussed but rarely implemented. Their children played at her feet, twins whose amber and silver eyes promised futures where designation meant gift rather than limitation, where strength served protection rather than domination. The revolution was complete, but the love story would last forever, passed down through generations, as proof that sometimes even the most impossible dreams could rewrite reality through nothing more than two souls who chose each other despite every logical reason why such choices should have been forbidden.